My friend and fellow author Blair Lynn remembers the moment the floor dropped out beneath her. What followed were panic attacks, ER visits, and waves of anxiety so intense they left her trembling, breathless, and afraid she might die. As a Christian, she knew she should cast her cares on God, but she didn't know how. In the depths of fear and discouragement, simple answers and spiritual cliches fell flat. There was no quick fix, no bypassing the valley. In Made to Tremble, Blair shares how she learned to walk with God through her anxiety, not around it. With scripture, story, and raw honesty, she shows what it means to embrace our weakness, not as failure, but as the place where God meets us most tenderly. This is a book for anyone who feels overwhelmed, afraid, or unsure if faith can hold in the storm. Through Blair's story, discover the peace of God and a deeper awe of the God of peace. Get your copy at madetotremble.com. The Sing hymnal, from award-winning hymn writers Keith and Kristen Getty, is a rich collection of classic and contemporary hymns created to deepen worship, foster unity in the church, and proclaim the hope that we have in Christ. Alongside beloved hymns, you'll also find psalms paired with songs, liturgical readings, and helpful indices, making this hymnal a lasting resource for families and congregations alike. Pick up your copy wherever books are sold, or get 30% off at crossway.org/gettyhymnal with a free Crossway Plus account. You guys are listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast, and I am here with Dr. Jeremy Meeks. Jeremy is the director and lead instructor of the Chicago course on preaching. He's also resident pastor for ministry apprenticeships at Christ Church Chicago. And before moving to Chicago to work full-time for the Charles Simeon Trust, he was lead pastor at Hope Community Church in Nashville, Tennessee. Fun fact, the church that I go to in Cambridge, Massachusetts, runs like little sub-courses of the Simeon Trust course, both for men and for women in our community, and a lot of people have found them super helpful. So if somebody's looking for more training in Bible teaching, then Simeon Trust is a wonderful place to go. Jeremy served as the director of Spanish language initiatives for the Charles Simeon Trust in his previous capacity, and before that he and his wife were church planting missionaries in Nicaragua. Jeremy did his undergrad work at Liberty University and an MA in bioethics from Trinity Graduate School. His thesis was on the distinction between robot and human bodies, and he went on to complete a PhD in theological ethics from the University of Aberdeen, Scotland. There, his dissertation utilised the rhetoric of Augustine, a 4th century church father and theologian, to reorient human desires for happiness, which many believe they will find in, and I quote, sex with robots. I love how, Jeremy, your bio then immediately says he is married to Marjorie and they have 2 children, Alexis and Jake. So, Jeremy, today I have invited you to talk with me about sex robots, or sex bots as they're commonly known. But before that, I was just chatting with Jeremy before we came online, and I said I'd Googled him to look up a detail of his bio and discover that there is in fact another Jeremy Meeks who has, let's say, a rather different background and life history. So do you want to, you said you had some funny stories to tell of the confusion that people sometimes have between you and the other Jeremy Meeks. So tell us one.
Oh, many. Well, Rebecca, first, thanks for having me on. It's fun to be here and always fun to talk about sex robots. But yeah, I get confused with, so that Jeremy Meeks that's more popular than me is commonly referred to as the hot felon. I don't know if he's
popular or not.
Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, his little moniker is the hot felon. So his mugshot got him famous, went all over the world, and he got a modeling contract out of it and all kinds of crazy stuff. Well, I was at a workshop in Mexico, and I had a guy walk up to me and he goes, "Oh, I'm so glad it's you." And I was like, "Oh, I guess I'm glad it's me too." But like, what do you mean you're glad that it's me? And he goes, "So my wife showed me a picture, and she goes, 'Is this the Jeremy Meeks who's going to be at this workshop that you're going to?' And he goes, 'Well, I don't know.' She goes, 'Well, if he looks like this, you need to run away because this is a very bad man.' He goes, 'But it's not you. So I'm very happy that you are you and you're not him.' I said, 'Oh, thank you.' This also happened. I was a keynote speaker at a conference one time, and I got introduced to a bunch of very kind and godly rural pastors as, this is Jeremy Meeks. He was never part of the gang of the Crips, and he's never been to jail, but he's really into sex robots. Let's welcome him.
Ooh.
I was preaching. I was preaching
that's not the
on
intro.
Psalm 19. Yeah. Nope, that's
Okay.
not the intro. So I had to lean in and say, I was in a gang. I've been to prison, and I'll talk to you about sex robots on the last day. So it was, it was a rather awkward start to a conference, but we got there.
Okay, I now have so many questions. So you were in a gang and you have been to prison?
No, that's not true. But it's like, two lies and a truth. It is. It's true.
Sometimes pastors come from, interesting backgrounds. So
I
I'd assume that the
do.
other Jeremy Meeks was a model and actor and then became a felon, but in fact it was the other way around.
It's the other way around, yeah.
Boy,
it's pretty fascinating.
That is
so
quite
I do have a rather checkered past, but thankfully I never got sent to prison, though I probably should have gone a few times.
Not quite that checkered. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so the first time I became aware of you, Jeremy, was when our mutual friend Rachel Gilson was reading your PhD dissertation on Augustine and sex with robots, and she kept sending me quotes and sort of thoughts. And Rachel is a in the best sense a highly critical reader. And so she will sometimes send me quotes from people's books that are not positive, let's put it that way, where she'll say, look at this sentence somebody wrote, and we'll think, oh my goodness, how did that sentence get published? But in your case, she was sending me sentences saying, oh, this is a really interesting thought. That's a really interesting observation. I'd never thought about that. And so I sort of stored that away in my little brain and thought, this would be an interesting thing to talk about, because as listeners may know if they've listened to me rambling on other topics, I'm keenly interested in sexual ethics and in the interplay between a biblical understanding of the purpose of sex and marriage and the various ways in which different cultures have tried to understand the purpose of our bodies, the purpose of sex, the purpose of marriage. I'm currently working on a book that's sort of looking at the first sexual revolution that happened in the Greco-Roman Empire when Christianity first sort of rose up and started changing how people were at that time thinking about sex, and then looking at the second sexual revolution and some of the sundry revolutions that have happened sort of since then in the West. It's fair to say this is the first time I have ever had a conversation with anybody about the question of sex with robots. But funny as it sounds, it's actually far closer to where we are kind of culturally today than perhaps many people listening to this podcast might like to think. So do you want to give us first an insight into why did you start exploring this topic in the first place, and how is it relevant to conversations today?
Yeah, that's the question I often get. So the reason why is, the dirty secret of writing a dissertation is write on something that people haven't written about. And the more untouched the topic, the wider the scope can be. And due mainly to my bioethics work, I was kind of fascinated by why humans are fascinated by robots, especially humanoid robots, but just robots in general and technology in general. And then as one who trains preachers for a living, mainly interested in like the persuasive nature of technology. And there's a lot of fraught debate about sex robots, like any kind of emerging technology, because all an emerging technology is something that's kind of like, we can see it coming, but it's not quite here. And so all you have are moral arguments for or against these things. And so there's a lot of arguments out there, both pro and con, and yet the debate seems incredibly like at an impasse, right? So the question that I wanted to kind of answer was, well, how might a Christian kind of split the difference and not just kind of either orism, but kind of say yes to what the pro side wants and the con side wants when it comes to sex with robots, but orient them towards something that would actually be truly satisfying. So, instead of just saying, well, here's everything that's wrong with sex robots, although for the, sake of the listener, I do conclude that they're not appropriate for human use. I did want to lean in as hard as I could to concede as much as I could, both about the struggles of human sexuality and the potential hypothetical benefits that sex robots might provide. And to say yes to everything I could possibly say yes to, and simply take the desires, which I don't think are bad all the time, and reorient them towards something positive. And it just so happens that Augustine was a good person to use, mainly because of the time in which he lived. You're talking about the first sexual revolution. Well, Augustine was all wrapped up in that because he talked a lot about sex. And he had, as a pastor, he was dealing with people who dealt with sexual stuff all the time. And as a public intellectual, he was dealing with the cultural mores of his day. And so he thought a lot about it and wrote a lot about it and preached a lot about it. So he's actually incredibly helpful in kind of getting to the heart of what we're looking for in sex and how those desires are often corrupted and how to be trained towards something ultimate and satisfying.
Okay, interesting. So I'm someone who finds Augustine in many ways exceedingly helpful and in some ways quite unhelpful. In that, so I think sometimes people, and I'm not saying that you take this view, sometimes people take the view, if Augustine said it, it must therefore be true. Kyle Harper's book, From Shame to Sin, which looks at the way in which Christianity changed how people thought about sex in the kind of Greco-Roman Empire, one of the comments he makes is that Augustine thought that prostitution was a necessary evil, which is one of the points where I would sort of take issue with our elder brother in the faith. But I'm sort of curious for the cliff notes of your thinking as you plucked somebody who's been incredibly influential and in many ways incredibly helpful to Christian thinking sort of historically from the fourth century and sort of applied some of his thinking to our current conversations now. Yeah, give us a little taste of what that conversation looked like in your thesis and where you landed and why. So
here's the Cliff Notes version. So Augustine was incredibly wrapped up in the fraught debates about the use of rhetoric. The kind of philosophers of his day were opposed to it mainly because they thought that the truth content of something didn't matter. It's only how you said something. So they're professional public speakers who were essentially just gaming the system to get people on their side. And he was like, okay, that's clearly wrong, but people are persuaded and persuasive. And so how do you use something to good ends? So, and if you're thinking about the arguments for anything, well, people are trying to persuade you to get on their side. And so really kind of all the arguments when it comes down to like the use of or the avoidance of the use of sex or robots for the purposes of sexual gratification, you can I lumped them into kind of three categories. So just very briefly, you've got the argument for human freedom. So sex robots are beneficial because you can do with them what you will, and you own them. So you have kind of an ontological security, right? They're never going to go away. You get it they're with you forever. And so you're not like with a human relationship, scared they're ever going to go away and you can do anything you want with them. And the con side says, well, I thought that like owning humans was bad and consent was a good thing. So maybe these robots are going to train us to go in terrible directions. And Augustine comes along and goes, no, human freedom is awesome. It's one of the best of all possible things. But what freedom looks like is the ability to do what God wants us to do because that's the way towards human flourishing. So yeah, humans should be maximally free and all that kind of stuff. And yet what freedom looks like is not simply what we want to do, but what God wants to do, which guards the goods of slavery, bad idea. Consent, real good thing. But yeah, freedom is important.
Oh no, well, I sort of do just because it's triggering so many things that I've been recently looking at. But hold I want to explore the number 2 and number 3 as well. But let's have a little interaction around number 1 first. Yeah, it's sort of fascinating because one of the pretty gruesome and horrific realities of the sexual norms in the Greco-Roman Empire sort of prior to the rise of Christianity was that people not only owned slaves, but that it was seen as perfectly normal, reasonable, natural, like not a moral problem for a master to use his either male or female slaves for sex. And it's one of, again, I mean, I know you know this, but in case some of our listeners don't, it's sort of one of the ways in which it's really hard for us to sort of wrap our minds around how people were thinking in the sort of Greco-Roman Empire prior to the rise of Christianity is like, the idea that it would not be morally problematic to have sex with one of the people who you sort of legally owned. The idea that it would be kind of beside the point whether they were male or female, which was very much the case in the Greco-Roman Empire, and the idea like our notions of consent are ones that are actually have come out of Christianity. So prior to Christianity, or at least our notions of consent for everyone, because the Greeks and the Romans had a notion of consent for like a freeborn woman whose chastity was her prized possession, essentially. And so, you could have a conversation about whether a woman was or was not consenting to sex outside of marriage, but you wouldn't even be asking the question whether an enslaved person was consenting because they were, I mean, I think Karl Harper puts it that they were kind of like furniture, essentially. So some of what you're saying, there's an eerie correspondence actually between how human beings were being used in the ancient world and, tragically in many parts of, like around the world today through the global sex industry, but like, an eerie correspondence between that and how robots or sort of sex robots are being conceived of today. It's just sort of interesting how contemporary some of those conversations are.
Yeah. And the argument that the kind of pro side uses is, we'll just play the game. Rebecca, are you a fan of the current challenges facing sex workers today? Are you a fan of like they're just like ignoring that and just leaning in and saying, yeah, no, we should use sex workers?
No, I'm for sure not a fan of using sex workers. Yes.
That's good. Okay, good. So wouldn't you think that it would be a better world if we had less sexual trafficking and less prostitution?
Yes.
Great. Then sex robots are potentially a way towards freeing those people because human desires are not going away. And so perhaps if we have sex robots, then we will lessen the burden on sex work providers. That's the way the argument goes. Now, of course, because no humans are actually being harmed in this, just human-like things. And there is good reason to believe that humans would find sex with robots satisfying, especially the more human-ish they are, the more they look like us and act like us and talk like us, move like us, and stuff like that. But of course, the con side comes along and goes, you do know there's like knock-on effects, right? Because while they're not people, what we know from human-robot interaction in general is that we tend to treat them as people. We tend to treat them as moral, sentient agents, even if they're not. So you can just think of like AI and how everybody's freaked out about like, oh, look, is this thing really thinking or whatever? And this isn't a problem just for some like, chump that doesn't know how to use computers that's running into this for the first time. Even developers get weirded out by this kind of stuff because of like how good and accurate some of the technology is. And so this is why you have debates about like, should you make your children say please and thank you to Alexa? It's not because people think that Alexa's a person necessarily that's speaking to them through a speaker, but it's like, but if we train them to not speak in those ways, then what's going to happen when they run into human interactions? Which is an interesting question, but the same thing applies to like, well, if you took that technology and put it into a human-looking body, then how is that going to affect human relationships? And the answer is like, we don't know because they don't exactly exist on a large market level yet. But it's like, do you really want to like screw up society and screw up humans just to figure out if these things work or not? Because while it's not involving humans, it's the only reason it's pleasurable or potential substitute is because of how human the thing is.
Yeah, and actually it is involving humans because the person having sex with the robot is in fact, I would argue, harming themselves. But I'll
That's
let you.
correct.
Let's look at point 2 and 3 because I stopped you after point 1 because I got too excited.
Oh yeah, it's great. So point 2 is about human companionship. So the pro side is like, look, a lot of people have trouble accessing sexual gratification. Lots of different groups of people, right? Like people who are disabled. Okay, there's one, or the elderly, right? How are they going to access sexual gratification? Or you can think of like incels. Right? So involuntary celibates, ordinarily males who feel that the society has formed perceptions of men and women that they don't fit into, so no women want them, and it's the culture's fault. Somebody, they have real trouble accessing sexual gratification. Or, the kind of case in point that we really don't want to think about is like pedophiles or those who are attracted to minors but don't act on those inclinations. What about them? People who are involved in like the BDSM community who think that like artifacts are necessary for their sexual gratification, or people with autism, like that have real trouble like interacting with other human beings. One argument is a way to kind of provide companionship for them is to give them sex robots. Because they can be tailored to people's needs and desires, and they don't have to feel awkward about interacting with a real person. And the con side comes along and goes, hey, friendship, companionship is incredibly important, but human problems need to be solved with human solutions. So it's not exactly charitable to get somebody who has trouble with other humans and go, well, here's a robot and go off into the corner and be gone. Augustine comes along and says, friendship is one of the greatest of all things, but what friendship looks like is doing good for the other not simply doing what the other wants. And so I get into the complicated notions of like, how do you love people who are very hard to love? And Augustine has a lot to say about loving enemies. Now, I don't think that like incels and minor attracted persons are necessarily my enemy. But if you think about what it looks like to love an enemy, and then if that's the greater and you work it down to the lesser, then we can learn stuff about like how to love people who are incredibly challenging to love, but providing for them real companionship. And what that looks like in the church and all kinds of stuff is what I get into. But Augustine kind of provides a path to love people who are hard to love, which the pro side argues for, but they don't have a lot of grounds for it.
Yeah, yeah. I would argue less articulately than Augustine that human beings do need love and human beings do not need sexual gratification. I think it's one of the great and harmful myths of our modern world, and not to say that it's only in our modern world, but the idea that you cannot in fact live without sexual satisfaction is untrue and has caused all sorts of troubles.
Yep, it has caused all kinds of troubles. And this isn't anything new, like you said. This has been going on for a very long time. And so I think that like one place that people can need to begin is even just admitting that like, hey, I can't even begin to imagine the struggles that you might have because I don't have those same kind of struggles. Before you're just like, oh, you don't need that. Especially if you have it. You know, it's one of those things where it's like, well, if you're happily married and you're telling somebody who isn't, like, oh, you should just be happy as you are. People are like, well, that's easy for you to say because you've got what I'm looking for. Now, I think that it's not a defeater of just like, well, if you've got it, then everybody should have it, because there's all kinds of things that people have that other people don't have. And just because, like you said, the key is that if you base your life around contentment being in what you have, then you're essentially setting yourself up for perpetual discontent, because you're never going to have everything everybody has.
What do you do when it feels like your spiritual life is crumbling? When trusted leaders fail, doubts rise, grief hits, and you don't know what to believe in anymore? In her new book, Someone to Believe In, Embracing the Saviour Who Stays the Same When Everything Else Changes, author and Bible teacher Courtney Reisig helps us to see Jesus' unshakable character. If you're not sure whether you believe in Jesus yet, or if your faith feels unsteady in the face of grieving, burnout, or disillusionment, this book invites you to encounter Jesus as the one who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Get your copy of Someone to Believe In today at someonetobelievin.com. I think, there are so many, it's sort of fun because there are so many different ways in which the directions this conversation could go in. I mean, one of the things that I've thought quite a bit about from the perspective of Christian sexual ethics, which says, and we should come back to this, but like sex only belongs in male-female marriage. And I will often have people say to me, you know, when I'm speaking talking about Christian sexual ethics with respect to people who like me are attracted to folks of their same sex. And people will say, well, how can you expect somebody who maybe is only ever attracted to somebody of their same sex to be lonely for the rest of their lives? And I think that question often comes up. And the underlying assumption is, if you are not in a sexual or romantic relationship, you are therefore lonely. Right. And I think the New Testament takes a massive wrecking ball and smashes that whole house down. And in fact, those who've listened to me rant on this podcast before will not be unfamiliar with this, but I think there are ways in which much of our Western sort of church community, I'm not wanting to speak for churches I haven't been part of, but like I think it's fair to say that the average church in the modern West has cottoned on to the fact that the Bible has a vision, a beautiful and good vision for male-female marriage and for parenting, and has completely missed the fact that this is actually a small subset within the larger kind of framework of love that the New Testament calls us to, which is the sort of basic heartbeat of the Christian life. It's actually brotherly and sisterly love. It's the family, community love, not something that's has a sexual or romantic kind of core to it in the way that Christian marriage does.
You can even take it further, because while that's a burden that like us, non-married people are often putting on themselves, I've often responded to such people by saying, do you really think that married people are happy? And don't put that burden on married people, because what a lot of discontent married people got married thinking that marriage was going to make them happy. and that now I have like the ability to have a fulfilling life. And it's like, well, your marriage can't bear the weight of happiness. So, everybody's like, well, you're happy because you're married. And you're like, well, it depends on the day. But like, I'm not going to say I'm always perpetually dissatisfied, but I can introduce you to a whole bunch of people who are married and are not happy and are not satisfied. And I don't even mean like non-Christian people, Christian, non-Christian alike. So the idea that like marriage is going to solve your loneliness problem is a complete farce. And if you put that on your marriage, then guess what? You're going to set yourself up once again for dissatisfaction because you're putting a burden on marriage that it can't bear. Now, I don't think that marriage is a bad thing. I'm married. I think it's great. But it is a real bummer how many married people are like, oh, I'm so sad. Sorry for you. I'll bet you're so lonely. And it's like, no, I know non-married people who are lonely, and I know married people who are lonely, and I know non-married people who are incredibly happy in their singleness, and married people who are incredibly happy in their marriage. It doesn't.
Yes.
The state doesn't actually change the thing.
Yeah, I would say yes and no. On the one hand, I'm a strong advocate for a Christian vision for both marriage and singleness being good things, and I think in the context of Christian community, both those appropriate ways of living as a Christian thrive. However, again, I'm working on this book at the moment, and one of the things that I'm looking at is the data on the relative happiness of people who are married versus people who are not married in the West today. And there's a massive happiness differential between people who are married and people who are not. Now, I actually think that's not only because of marriage. I think that's because of the ways in which our like communities have the fact that often people who are not married are lonely, which is not to say that many people who are married could not be lonely as well. But I think there are more systemic problems. I don't think it's just a because you're not married, therefore kind of scenario. At the same time, I think sometimes people overstate the extent to which marriage is. I think people can make the error on both sides, as it were. People can make marriage out to be the be all end all, which biblically it's not, and experientially and data wise it's not. And on the other side, people can say, oh well, no difference. Some people are unhappily married, some people are happily single, and therefore there's like in our current moment, kind of culturally, no differential there, and actually there's a sort of meaningful differential there. Are we still on point 2? I forget.
We are. Yeah. So if companionship is a good thing, then we need to learn how to embrace all different kinds of people. And until the church can legitimately find ways to love people who are incredibly hard to love, then they're going to have a real hard time arguing against sex robots. Because one of the things that I bring up is that like it's not sufficient for the church to simply say, that's gross, don't touch that. This is like the whole like expulsive powers of a new affection kind of thing. Like you got to have something else to put in its place. Now, I think that what goes in its place is Christian community. But if you don't actually promote a multifaceted vision of Christian community, then you've got no room to speak. If everybody needs to look like you and vote like you and have your same kind of status and whatever when it comes to money, race, age, or whatever, then it's like it's totally illegitimate. So Christian community is really easy when everybody's just like you. But when there's people who are very different than you in all kinds of ways, and in this way in particular, like sexual orientation and desires and all kinds of stuff like that, then you actually can't be claiming to follow the commands of Christ of loving your neighbor unless you're seeking to love all of them.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Companionship is great, and Augustine provides a way for providing for the deepest needs of what the pro-sex bot community is arguing for, and it helps bolster the kind of con side that goes, I get it, but like, what about like human solutions? But they don't really have a basis for giving those human solutions. The third realm in which sex robots come up is the whole transhumanism thing. Essentially, that the sex robots are an inevitable part of human progress. So sex robots are kind of experimenting with the kinds of bodies we will one day be able to inhabit if we so desire. Because the transhumanists really argue for a utopian vision of society on the basis of like a couple of different problems that we're facing. So sickness and death, that's one, and fairness. So the biggest problem with humans is that we get sick and die. And also like, it's just really unfair that Rebecca, you can dunk a basketball and I can't. And so like through kind of the improvement of, me too. So through the improvement of our bodies, we'll achieve like this, moment of kind of equilibrium where we don't have to die and everybody's the same. The con side comes along. This is actually where Karl Marx is really helpful. And he goes, okay, the people who are borrowing some of his arguments to go, okay, cool. So let's see if we got this right. In order to achieve an ideal human future everybody has to have the same things and look the same. Well, guess what? Who's going to build those things? And also, what's the vision of the future? The vision of the future is often like, middle-aged white men. That's the kind of idealized future. And we're never going to get sick and die? That sounds like the most conservative argument on the face of the planet. And who's going to make those things? Mostly women, mostly poor. And what they're going to build are bodies that don't look like them for people that they don't know. And it's going to be something that they can never access. And even if they could access it, what they're accessing is something not like them. So they have to become like something else in order to be truly accepted. Cool. That doesn't seem to be all that kind of progressive. In fact, it's actually rather, retrograde, old school kind of thinking. Augustine comes along and goes, guess what? Getting sick and dying is a huge problem. And kind of fairness is also a huge problem. Have you ever heard of the resurrection and the new heavens and new earth, which solves for a lot of our problems? And the cool thing about Augustine is he doesn't make people have to become something else in order to be truly what they are. He has space for people who actually carry their disabilities with them into the new heavens and the new earth. Because he's like, well, the problem is not our disabilities. It's how our disabilities hinder us from experiencing true happiness. So he's like, whatever our bodies are going to be, and he's perfectly willing to grant these, totally hypothesizing because he doesn't really know. You don't know, and I don't know exactly what those bodies are going to be like. He goes, what we need are not idealized bodies. What we need are bodies fit for the experience of happiness forever. And that's the kind of bodies we're going to have. So essentially our disabilities aren't going to hinder us from experiencing all the pleasures of life in the new heavens and new earth. And on that level, it will be fully fair, no sickness, no death. And the problem with the robots in a world like that is that it trains us for a happiness of our own making. It's also really highly suspect. Is that actually what we're going to be like? And is that really the ideal world? Still being here in this messed up world that is able to inhabit bodies when we want to and how we want to? Is that as high as the vision goes? Essentially, the vision isn't high enough. So at the end of the dissertation, I'm essentially arguing for heterosexual marriage and Godward committed singleness as a profound statement against sex robots, providing a better vision for the world. So ironically, I end up arguing for the most conservative thing in the world, but doing it in the most backward way humanly possible.
Well, so I would argue that you are and you are not arguing for the most conservative thing in the world, because again, having sort of spent the last several months with my head sort of stuck in the scriptures on these questions in the nicest possible way, and just reflecting more and more on what is marriage and what is sex from a biblical perspective, and what is the Christian vision for marriage. And I think a lot of people who would be sort of categorized as conservative on these questions would say, well, the vision for marriage is that marriage is primarily about having children, and that it's fulfilling this great kind of the commission that we're giving at the beginning of the Bible, when God says to the first man and woman who are made in his image, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. And that marriage is sort of the highest kind of calling for a Christian man or woman. And people will often talk in those terms, women who would say my husband and my children are my highest priority. This is my greatest calling, and a man sort of saying likewise. I actually think the Bible is telling us something that from a distance can look like that, but actually when you look more closely isn't. Because in fact, what the Bible is telling us from the beginning to the end, literally from Genesis to Revelation, we see this sort of arc being, the sort of followed, is that marriage is a one flesh union between one man and one woman, as we see at the end of Genesis 2. And it's a really kind of weird thing that gets said at the end of this creation account in Genesis 2, where God says, or the text says, therefore a man will leave his father and his mother, be united to his wife, and they should become one flesh. And you're like, well, it's just sort of funny thing to say, two people becoming one flesh. Yeah. And then you see this metaphor building through the Old Testament of God as a husband and Israel as a often unfaithful wife. And you start thinking, okay, so I'm seeing kind of on the ground, I'm seeing all these violations of the one flesh union of one man and one woman, everything from, prostitution to adultery to incest to polygamy to you name it, to rape. And then you see Jesus coming and saying he's the bridegroom. And one of the ways in which he's stepping into the shoes of the creator, the God revealed in the Old Testament, is he's saying I'm the husband, I've come to claim God's people for myself. And you hear Paul, the Apostle Paul, explaining in one of his letters, letter to the church in Ephesus, that from the very beginning, from when that first statement was made, therefore a man will leave his father and his mother, be united to his wife, they should become one flesh. That was always about Jesus' relationship with his people. And then in Revelation, at the very end of the Bible, we see this picture of the wedding of the Lamb. I was talking in a previous episode with Jen Wilkin sort of about Revelation, about this whole idea of Jesus as the sacrificial lamb who is also the husband of God's people. And you see like a very penultimate chapter of the Bible, the New Jerusalem coming down like a bride prepared for her husband. So what is marriage about? First and foremost, from a Christian perspective, it's about picturing Jesus' love for his people.
Yep.
And this one flesh union is a whole different, like it gives a whole different meaning to sex than the other meanings that are ascribed to it. Like, the sex bot vision is based on the idea that the purpose of sex is pleasure, presumably.
Right.
I mean, that's sort of giving you sort of pleasure with somebody else. And it's not that pleasure is absent from a Christian vision, but it's actually about a joining. It's like a one fleshing of two people, which means that it cannot be substituted by something that is, with a non-person, like a robot. And it also means that it's something that doesn't actually work if it's with like a series of people, which is, often in our kind of cultural context, a sense of sort of sex without commitment being perhaps the best form of sex, because, you're really just kind of looking, you're maximizing your gratification, as it were, or like maximizing the attractiveness of your partner or whatever it is. And I'm sort of thinking, well, no, this is massively missing the point of what sex is about, which is in fact being part of this permanent one flesh union of two people, and that there is something so much more beautiful and real about that. I was reading an article a few years ago, which the title of the article was something like, if I met my husband now, like at a bar, would I find him attractive? Like, is he the one who I just saw the title of that. I thought, what a ridiculous, like how utterly beside the point. Because I don't walk around thinking, oh, well, let me evaluate my husband's relative attractiveness to every other sort of man that I might see. He's mine. He's mine.
Right.
And like what, kind of almost like I look at my children, and the reason that I want these particular children, not just like any other children out there who might theoretically have, like, I don't know, better qualities than them in various ways. They're not mine. These are my children. That there's a complete failure to understand the mineness that is at the heart of a Christian vision for sex within marriage, and the union that is it's about bringing two particular people together in a permanent love relationship that reflects Jesus' love for his people. Like it's so much more beautiful than we often realize, even within the church, and therefore we shouldn't put a weight on it that it's not designed to bear, because it's pointing to something so much greater than itself. Sorry, I just went off on my soapbox there.
No, that's great. Get on that soapbox. It's a good soapbox to be on. And like, that's why, so I say something that, gets me in trouble, but whatever. I deal with sex robots. All I do is deal in trouble. But like, I think the church should thank God for sex robots in this sense. I wish I lived in a different kind of world. But this is exactly the kind of world I've been given, which means if God's actually in charge of things, then this is the kind of world that God wants right now. And because God has designed the time and place in which I live and you live, and we live in a world of sex robots, then I've got to find a way to both begrudge the fact that this thing exists, but also thank God for it. And one of the reasons we can thank God for it is because it actually causes us to ask unique kinds of questions and give unique kinds of answers. And in living in the way that the Bible's always called us to live, all of a sudden it becomes incredibly subversive, which is actually a lot of fun. And so like you have to rethink a lot of things, not to necessarily change your mind, but come to, in a lot of ways, firmer conclusions on things that maybe you always believed as a result of being forced to think about something that you'd rather not think about. But by thinking about those things, you come to a greater appreciation of and delight in the way actually God made the world. And so if we can do that and go like, oh, okay, well, maybe I wish these things didn't exist, but they do. So let me find a way to appreciate at least how I'm being trained to think and appreciate the way that God has shaped human beings to live. And then, having understood that, then fully embrace the way that God calls human beings to live and delight in it possibly even more than I ever have as a result of having to think about something I wish didn't exist.
I like what you did there. Yeah, it's so interesting as people think about artificial intelligence and creating sort of robots that not only look like humans, but feel like humans and can act like humans. it presses us to ask, okay, well, what is the secret source of being a human? And it's not in any one capacity, because any one capacity you want to pick, there are going to be humans who do not have that capacity. And if we go back to the very beginning of the Bible, the two first things that we are told about human beings are, number one, that we are made in the image of God, and number two, that we are made male and female. And the fact that human beings are made in the image of God is extraordinary and mysterious, because we don't know exactly what that means.
Yep.
But we do have a sense of what that means, in that as I interact with you as somebody who is made in the image of God, I can see something of God because I'm interacting with you. Like there is there's a way in which your embodied reality, even as you're on a video call from Chicago, hundreds of miles away, I'm interacting with somebody else who bears at their most fundamental level the image of the creator God of all the universe. And if you and I are designed, in fact, for relationship with the creator God of all the universe, then the best and most loving relationships we can have with one another are giving us a kind of little taste of that, a little foretaste of what it's going to be like if we've trusted in Jesus to live with Jesus forever and with his people together. And there's no way, like even theoretically, a robot could take the place of somebody who's made in the image of God, because a robot isn't. Like at best, we can make robots in our image. And that's, the most massive downgrade imaginable from being made in the image of God. Yeah.
And like the thing is, and you get to the whole capacities thing. I mean, one of the terrifying things about robots or whatever is like, oh, well, they're going to take our jobs and all that kind of stuff. And while it is incredibly complicated to figure out like what a human being is, because like you said, like even the image of God stuff and male and female, those are fundamental, foundational categories. And you're like, I don't know exactly what that means, but like Robert Spademan's got this great book on persons, where he's like, even if we don't exactly know like what a person is, the weird thing is we can always recognize it. And when it comes to robots, like we can be deceived. You can be deceived by both like chatbot agents and all that kind of stuff. And we're not at the level yet of being able to be deceived when it comes to like humanoid robots yet, but that day's probably coming. But at the same time, there's just something about humans that is always going to be forever distinct. Even if we're convinced that something is a human, it's still not a human. Even if, like, as we go like, oh yeah, what is a human? That those questions are incredibly complicated. You're just like, yeah, but there's something not about that. And the nice thing about the Bible is it comes along and goes, yeah, no matter how much it looks like or whatever a human, it's not. If it's not a human created in the image of God. And you go, oh man, like, and you could trip out about that for a while. But it's also why, like, when we see like monkeys or dolphins doing things that have like certain traits of like humans, you go like, oh yeah, those are human-ish kinds of things. But you never look at a dolphin and go like, oh, that's a human. Because there's something about humans where you're like, I don't even know what it is, but I know that's a person. It makes us so like infinitely fascinating and diverse and unique.
Yeah, and I think why even, imagine the billionaire with his perfectly designed, futuristic humanoid sex partner. I feel desperately sorry for that guy.
Right.
And I do say guy because I think it's far more something.
They're often, there's more men than women. There are women who are wrapped up in this, but it's far more often men.
Yeah. Well, Jeremy, I'm sure we've raised more questions than we've answered, but that's always a good
goal.
That's always a good episode of the Confronting Christianity podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really glad you're not the felon.
Me too.
And appreciate this conversation. I'm hoping that at some point in the not too distant future, you'll write a book about this that we can all read and dig into in more detail. So stay tuned for that, oh dear listener. I'll definitely have Jeremy back to talk when he's turned his PhD into a book. You guys have been listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast. You can follow us on X or Twitter. I was nearly said Facebook. You can't on Facebook because there's nothing's happening on Facebook to do with this podcast. Instagram is what I meant to say. You could leave a review on iTunes saying how much you disagreed with everything that Jeremy said and how much you agreed with every word that I said. No, jokes.
Yeah, I'd love it.
No, you could read a review on You could write a review on iTunes suggesting if you would like a future topic to be discussed and explored on this podcast. And between now and next time I talk into your earphones or AirPods, maybe reflect on what it means for somebody to be made in the image of God, and how utterly, utterly irreplaceable we are as embodied beings in one another's lives in all sorts of ways, not only in the area of sort of sexual or romantic relationships, but in every possible area of life. There is nothing more precious than for us to be engaging with the God of all the universe and to be connecting with people made in his precious image.